Hello everyone, my name is Christina and I'm a medical student studying at Newcastle University, and in this video I've got 6 questions for you. The way that this video is going to work is me in the white top, I'm going to be the interviewer and I'm going to ask you guys some questions. I'm going to give you guys a few seconds to think of your answer, pause the video, and if you can, say it out loud. If not, just have a think about what you would say, and then Christina in the black top is going to give you like a model answer of what you could say, and then after each question I'm going to give you some tips and advice on how to answer these questions and just to give you a bit more information. For the 6 questions, I have 1 hot topic question based on coronavirus, 2 medical ethics questions, a character trait question, and then 2 role plays. Now, without further ado, question 1. How do you think the government handled the coronavirus pandemic? So I think that the government did the best that they could in terms of keeping the public safe, whilst also making sure that we had a strong economy and trying to keep people in work. So implementing the first lockdown I do think was a good idea. However, I understand that there was criticism in terms of how late the lockdown was implemented. For example, a lot of other European countries did go into lockdown a few weeks before us. And there were statistics and figures to show that if we went into lockdown a couple of weeks earlier, we may have had thousands of less deaths. And that is like really tragic to know about. However, I think the fact that the government decided to put in a second lockdown later on to try and help us have Christmas, which sadly that's been reversed because of the new variant, and we've implemented tier 4 to try and combat that. I do think it is such a tricky time because it's unprecedented times. I know that's been said a lot, but it's just such an unpredictable time, and the government are, I guess, doing the best that they can with such a new situation and scenario. They're kind of thinking on their feet, and they're using, I'm glad that they're using like all the different research and scientific advice to try and use that in conjunction with implementing laws to try and help keep everyone safe. I do think the government's done a good job. I understand that there's criticism, but it's just such a difficult time in terms of that they've never probably dealt with anything like this before. This is the first time that we've had a pandemic in my lifetime, and I think in the older generation's lifetime as well. So I think the government are just doing the best that they can. Matt Hancock did a really good job of deciding to introduce the Nightingale hospitals earlier on in the pandemic, which thankfully we didn't actually need the hospitals that much because I think the NHS managed to cope with the number of patients. However, I do think that the government has done certain things like introducing the Nightingale hospitals, Eat Out to help out to keep the economy strong and allow bars and restaurants to open, and a few other things. For example, introducing the tier system. I think the government has done a number of things which have been helpful in keeping the public safe, but also allowing people to have somewhat of a normal life compared to first lockdown, which was just absolute isolation. There isn't a right or wrong to this answer. Honestly, what the interviewers are looking for is just how you come to your conclusions, what sort of things you're talking about, and like the reason behind it. Here are some of the key things that you really want to mention in your answer. So things like the opening of the Nightingale hospitals, Eat Out to help the economy when we came out of the first lockdown, the government decision to go into first and second lockdown, as well as like the timings of it. So if you think about like other European countries, we did go into lockdown fairly late. So things like that, they'd love to hear from you, as well as the UK being the first country to roll out the Pfizer vaccine. Now, at the time of filming this right now, we've only just started rolling out the vaccine, so depending on when you're watching this, there might be more news on this, or there might be like new things happening. So make sure to stay up to date with the news. So guys, editing Christina here. On reflection, I've just realised that there was actually a lot more that the government could have done, and I don't think I stressed that in my answer. For example, the UK actually had, I think, one of the highest death tolls in Europe, if not the highest, and that's mainly because we went into lockdown so late. Also, there was a period of time where doctors and healthcare workers were told to wash PPE instead of like disposing of it properly. Also, a bunch of people, especially like children, went without food, and there was that whole scandal about free school meals and whether or not that should carry on into the summer holidays and stuff. There was also the whole Dominic Cummings scandal, which Boris was like, that wasn't a huge deal, he kind of like supported him, and so many other things. So I don't think I did a good enough answer, to be honest. That probably wasn't a fantastic answer because I only talked about positive or good things, but you guys can definitely stress the fact that the government could have done more, because they definitely could have. You absolutely do not have to agree with everything that the government's done. If you have got a criticism, if you have got an opinion on like maybe the government could have done this or this would have been nice to see from the government, definitely mention that. That's why they're asking you this question. They want to know that you're staying up to date with what Matt Hancock, the health secretary, is doing, what the government is doing, especially during a time when like health is so important. Like they just want to know what your opinions are and see whether or not you've done your research on what's happening right now. Okay, question 2, moving on to medical ethics. If you had the choice to give a liver transplant to a successful elderly member of the community or to give it to a 20-year-old drug addict, who would you allocate the organ to and what factors would influence your decision? Yeah, so that's a tough one. Assuming that they're both a match for the liver, because I know that with any form of like organ transplant, including a liver transplant, you do have to make sure that the donor liver and then the recipient are a match, otherwise the liver will be rejected. So assuming that they're both a match, I guess the next thing you would want to have a think about is is the size of the liver best suited to the 20-year-old or the elderly patient? Because someone who's donated a liver that's like quite big, that liver won't be suitable for like a smaller patient. So that's another thing you'd have to think about. In terms of deciding who it would go to, I guess I've read that you have to kind of not look at the age of the patient. So, you know, you might be tempted to have a think that the 20-year-old, they deserve it more because they're gonna, you know, use it for longer. But actually what you want to have to think about is who's going to benefit most. You normally decide who to give the liver or the organ to the patient who is in more clinical need of that organ. So if there's a patient who has been using drugs, assuming that maybe they have used like needles. I know that if you're like a needle drug user, then you are at risk of certain things like hepatitis, which damages your liver. So in that case, maybe the 20-year-old might be in need of it more because his liver has suffered more damage. Whereas the elderly patient, in the information given, there wasn't really any mention of liver damage. So in that case, I guess in terms of clinical need, it might be the younger patient, the 20-year-old, who's in need of it more. Also, you'd have to think about quality adjusted life years. So who's going to have more years and a better quality of life in those years if they're given the liver? It's really difficult to kind of measure that and decide how, you know, who's going to benefit more in the long term. But I guess in this case, if a patient has been using drugs and might have liver damage as a result, they might benefit more just because I guess a fresh start would be beneficial for them. This is a classic medical ethics question, so I had to mention it. You might be tempted into thinking that the drug addict doesn't deserve it because they've obviously got high risk behavior, and maybe if they get the new organ they'll also damage that one as well. However, whenever you're allocating an organ for a transplant, you always base your decision on clinical need. That is so important. So with any question like this where they're like, who would you give it to, just think who is in need of it more, like who's had more damage or who would benefit from the most, who's suffering in terms of that organ the most, if that makes sense. So with this question, with drug addicts, in terms of drug, there's obviously different types of recreational drugs. Assuming that it's the type of drug that would like use needles, anytime that you're injecting yourself with a foreign substance, there is the risk of acquiring certain diseases, for example HIV and also hepatitis. Hepatitis is a disease which damages the liver. You don't need to know lots of detail about these diseases and stuff, but hepatitis damages the liver. So if someone at 20 already has liver damage, then that is like a huge issue and they probably will need the organ slightly more. But there's no right or wrong answer to this. What they're looking at is whether you understand medical ethics and what kind of reasoning you'll use to draw to your conclusion. So if you're using just the idea that, you know, this person's young, this person's old, that's not quite the right reasoning. They want to know that you're thinking about clinical needs and stuff like that. It's also a great thing to just think out loud. Like honestly, if you're thinking, I'm not quite sure, mention that you're not quite sure and like let them know what your reasoning is, because they'll be interested to hear that. So you might notice that in my answer I kind of like hesitated and I kind of said I think it's in good medical practice. That is perfectly okay if in your answer you're not quite sure if you've read something right, or, you know, if you're not quite sure, that is okay. Mentioning things like good medical practice and tomorrow's doctors is fantastic because it shows that you've done your research, it shows that you're well read and you've done your prep for your interviews. So it's okay if you're not quite sure where you've read something, as long as you mention it, that's great. Okay, question 3. You are a junior doctor working on an elderly care ward and one of the patients, Mrs. Hutchinson, You've been looking after for 4 weeks and is due to be discharged later today. Mrs. Hutchinson is very grateful for the care you've given her and wants to express her appreciation for you. On her way out, she offers you a £100 gift card and explains that this is just a gift that she has for you. Explain what you would do in this scenario. Having been in hospital for a month, I can understand why Mrs. Hutchinson probably wants to show gratitude to the doctors that looked after her or just the one doctor. However, I would probably make it clear to her that as part of like our role as a doctor, we aren't allowed to accept individual gifts from patients, and that does include the £100 gift card that she's just offered. I would make an effort to explain how grateful I am to her and how I've been happy to look after her. I wouldn't want to offend her in any way, but I would make it quite clear that I wouldn't be able to accept it. I do think that it's against GMC guidelines. I think I read something in Good Medical Practice about it not being allowed to accept like gifts or cash from patients. It's a bit different when it's like chocolates or something like that, because you can share that with the ward. However, with a £100 gift card, that's a bit more tricky. If there was time, I might ask one of the senior members of staff or maybe my consultant or my registrar if maybe we could use that gift card to buy something for the ward, but then I wouldn't accept it on, I wouldn't accept it on my own behalf because I know that that's not allowed. So I'd make sure that I mentioned that to the patient, but I wouldn't want to offend her. I'd make sure that she was just understanding of that. I did check in Good Medical Practice and it does say that you must not accept any gifts from patients or colleagues that might affect the way that you prescribe or treat patients. So it's always best to just not accept personal gifts given to you. If it's for the ward, as I mentioned in my answer, like chocolates can be given, to the staff room or given to everyone, but anything that's like personal for you should be avoided. Cards are completely okay, but yeah, anything else is to be avoided. You probably want to let the patient know that thank you, but no. Okay, question 4, moving on to the character trait question. Tell me about a time that you've shown leadership. So a few years ago, I went on an expedition to Morocco with my school. There was a group of around 10 to 12 of us, I think, and we were away for 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, part of my a time that I showed leadership was for a couple of days. During that time, I was team leader. So my role included just making sure everyone else knew about their role and letting everyone know, what they could do as part of the bigger team to just help us kind of work together. I also had the role of speaking to our travel guide and interpreter and just keeping them within the loop of what's happening with us and where we need to go. I also had the role of getting us from A to B, because in Morocco we did travel quite a bit, so it was my job to kind of get us to and from places, organise transportation and let everyone know when we were going, what time and stuff like that, and as well as to try and like diffuse and fix any problems within the team that we had. So yeah, I did have a couple of roles during that time. I'd say I'm not someone who jumps at leadership roles. However, I do know it's a really important skill of any good doctor and any, most medical students. So it is something that I am trying to work on. Sorry for that notification. But yeah, I'd say that I am learning a lot more about leadership through just playing a sport. So I've played netball for a few years now. I have been team captain a couple of times, which it's never as scary as I feel like it is. It normally just involves me, again, like speaking to everyone within the team, making sure that they know, what position they're playing, sorting out the equipment before and after matches, and speaking to our coach as well, making sure that transportation is organised for any matches that we have. So with any question like this in terms of leadership or teamwork or empathy, have an idea of a scenario where you have demonstrated those skills. That is, a thing that I would definitely try and prepare before your interview. So for me, whenever I'm asked about leadership, I always talk about Morocco. Whenever I'm asked about teamwork, I always talk about netball. Have an idea of what you've done to demonstrate those skills, and maybe a few other ones. For example, as I said, leadership, teamwork, empathy if you can, overcoming an obstacle, that's quite a popular one. Try and think about scenarios where you've overcome those things or demonstrated those skills. When talking about character traits, you also don't want to kind of waffle. Just mention the key bits. Think about what they would want a doctor to say, like what sort of things would they want a doctor to demonstrate. They want you to talk about the things that you actually did, how you found the teamwork. Is it something that you love doing? Is it something that you're working on? I tried to mention that in my answer as well. And it's okay to not be jumping at the thought of being a leader, or if you would consider yourself someone who doesn't mind leadership, that's okay to mention that as well. Okay, question 5, the first roleplay question. Your patient has an ectopic pregnancy and requires to have an abortion. She refuses to have the abortion because to her, that means murder. Explain what you would do in this scenario. Having an abortion or even considering having an abortion is an extremely personal and emotional experience, so I completely understand why the patient had those views, or why maybe she was like worried or, you know, not really wanting to have an abortion. I would completely understand that, and I would definitely reassure the patient that she's completely entitled to have those beliefs, and we completely understand why she has them. I think in this case I would maybe make an effort to explain what an ectopic pregnancy is, because maybe the patient isn't fully aware of that yet. So to my knowledge right now, an ectopic pregnancy is when the baby isn't growing in the right place, and that can lead to complications further down the line, and I think it can have some issues with labour and birth as well. So I'd explain that to the patient. Hopefully that would give them a better idea of what an ectopic pregnancy is. Then I would explain why having an abortion is the treatment that we would recommend her to have. So you wouldn't want to have any complications with your baby. I'm sure, you know, as a mum, or you know, as a mum to be, you'd want your baby to just be happy and healthy. So if there's the chance of complications, you know, we would maybe hope that you wouldn't want to have those complications. So in this case, an abortion would mean that you wouldn't have those. I guess there are better ways to explain it, but I'd probably explain to her that we just don't want her to have complications later on down the line, and so that's why we are recommending having an abortion, depending on what stage she is at in her pregnancy. I know that earlier on in pregnancy, abortion just involves taking, I think, 2 pills, so it's not a scary procedure. It's nothing that she has to like be frightened about. I know that, you know, the perception of abortion can be quite varied, and some people have a really daunting perception of it. So I'd maybe reassure the patient as well that it's actually not a super scary procedure that you have to be worried about. Having explained those things to her, hopefully she would have a better understanding of both an ectopic pregnancy and an abortion. And if she still has the views that it's murder, then again, you know, as healthcare professionals, I would completely respect that, and I would not want to change her mind or force her to do anything that she doesn't want to do. As a patient, she has the right to autonomy, which is one of the 4 pillars of medical ethics, which means that she's entitled to decide what treatment she has and doesn't have. So even if there are the risk of complications and she's aware of them, she doesn't have to go ahead with an abortion if she doesn't want to. So again, as her healthcare provider, I would probably just respect this decision and just help her have a healthy as possible pregnancy, with it being an ectopic pregnancy as possible. I'd let her know of any risks or side effects that might come up later on down the line. But again, if she doesn't want to have an abortion, we can't force that on her because she does have autonomy. So this is a really tough one. In terms of ectopic pregnancies, you guys don't need to know the ins and outs of that, because as you can imagine, there's so many different diseases that they can pluck up and mention to you in your MMIs. So you don't need to know details about ectopic pregnancies. So because this is quite a medical heavy question, I made sure in my answer to kind of emphasize that you want to explain to the patient what is happening. It's really easy when the word abortion is thrown around for someone's like emotions to get involved. Obviously people have strong beliefs about that. So in terms of the patient, you want to kind of remind them that it's okay to have those feelings and have those beliefs, but in terms of like medicine, this is kind of what's happening. So that's why there was emphasis on explaining it to the patient. In terms of this question, you also want to kind of touch on medical ethics, so things like autonomy. You could also mention things like non-maleficence or beneficence. Those are all great things to mention as well. So you are a junior doctor on a ward, and one morning a registrar, Dr. A, messages you saying that she's going to be 1 hour late. The patient, Mr. B, says that Dr. A promised to discharge him early in the morning. He says that he has to be at work for 9 and it's now 8:30. The trip to work is a 20-minute drive. Would you discharge the patient? That's a difficult one, because I think in order to maintain the doctor-patient relationship, if you've promised the patient something, it's probably, you know, in your best interest if you stick to that promise, just to make sure that there's still trust there. However, with Dr. A quite far away, and you know, only like a 5-minute gap between when she might arrive and when the patient needs to go to work, I guess it doesn't make sense to wait for her to arrive. So I'd probably speak to the patient, make sure that they're in the loop and I'm communicating with them. I'd let them know that, you know, their doctor isn't at work yet and she is running late and she probably won't be here in time to just discharge him. But I'd let him know that I'm going to go speak to some of the registrar and some of the senior doctors, check with them if they're happy to discharge him, because we wouldn't want to discharge him if there's a couple of more things that we need to check, or if we're not quite satisfied that he's healthy enough to leave the hospital. So I'd let him know this. I'd let him know that I'm going to have a chat to some of the seniors and check if they're happy for him to go home. I would then go chat to the seniors, check if they're happy for him to go home. If they are happy and they think that he's fit and healthy to leave, then in that case I would feel comfortable discharging the patient. I'd also maybe have a look in the patient notes. So I know that with every single patient in a hospital, you would write up some notes in terms of how they're doing, what scans they've had, any investigations like blood tests. So I'd maybe have a look into those and see if he's like improving, or if there's like maybe a couple of things that aren't quite right, if there's any red flags. So I'd have a look at the notes as well to help my decision. If I spoke to the seniors and then they weren't quite happy that he's fit and healthy enough to go home, or maybe they didn't know enough about the patient, then I'd maybe take that on board and maybe let the patient know that, you know, we're really, really sorry, but we're just not quite ready to let you go yet. I know Dr. A promised that you'd be going home today, but we just aren't feeling that confident. We don't know enough about you yet. So it's much better that the patient misses the morning of work or the day of work than they're discharged and they're unhealthy and something happens and then they're ending up in hospital again. I'd much rather that they just stay here a little bit longer to make sure that we're happy to let them go. So yeah, once I've done that, I'd probably let the patient know, keep them in the loop, because I think communication is important. Sometimes in hospitals, as a patient, you're just kind of like left in the dark a bit, and you know, all the doctors and nurses are talking about you and you don't quite know what's going on. So I think that's really important. I make sure that they know what's happening and what we're thinking in terms of discharging them. But yeah, I guess it depends on what the seniors think and what their notes say. I'd use those things to take into account to decide whether or not I would discharge them. So with this one, it's quite tricky. There's no right or wrong answer. What you're going to be marked on is how you come to the conclusion. So it's not about like the end goal of getting the answer. It's they want to know what sort of thought process you have in the middle. So that's kind of why I touched on, you know, yes, I would if, you know, the seniors, people with more experience, people who know what they're doing, give me the go ahead and say, yes, you can discharge the patient. But then I also talked about no, what if there's a couple of things we need to double check before we can let them go. Last few tips for you guys: make sure to have a bottle of water nearby. I know that talking, like even me just filming this video, I'm like, my throat's getting dry. Make sure to have a bottle of water with you, as well as some tissues. I know that's quite random, but if you're like me and you get a bit like teary or like emotional when you're nervous, definitely have some tissues nearby, just so it's not awkward if you have to like run out the room and get tissues and stuff in the middle of your interview. Just make sure your nerves are calm, make sure you're doing like breathing exercises beforehand, meditate if you have to, you know, go for a walk, whatever it is. Just make sure you're super relaxed by the time that your interview comes around. Make sure to check out my other MMI videos. I have a whole entire playlist for those videos linked here. Good luck for your interviews. Bye.